Hi everyone, and for new people coming in, this will be great. I'm Pete Davis, I'm a 2L here at the law school, and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum, the longest running American law school speaker series. We are focusing on our law school's mission statement this year, which is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. We want speakers who inspire us to not just monetize our law degrees by advancing the legal interests of the wealthy and powerful, but rather to deploy them to help address the important crises of our day facing the broad public. There is a crisis in the law today. A quarter of our neighbors grow up in poverty. 4/5 of civil legal needs go unmet. Our prisons have ballooned eightfold over the past decades. Eightfold. Nothing balloons by that much. Public interest lobbyists and lawyers in DC are outnumbered 34-1 by corporate interest lobbyists and lawyers. A white-collar crime wave like the wage theft epidemic, which has resulted in $20 billion stolen from working families, are left with too few cops on the beat, and law schools like ours are not leading the way out. This isn't breaking through to law school students like us because the pre-professional rat race has a certain gravitational pull to it, diverting our focus from the structural to the trivial, blurring our sense of right and wrong, and caging our moral imagination and diminishing our belief in our own civic power. But fortunately, there is hope. If we build up our own vision of justice and draw ourselves closer to the reality of today's injustices, then we can inoculate ourselves from this pull, liberating our civic powers to take an alternative path. This requires clarity of thought and a willingness to speak in a language of morality that has become alien to most people our age. And that's why I wanted to invite the Bruenigs here today, because they have that clarity of thought and vision, because they are willing to speak in a language of just and unjust, right and wrong, good and not so good, and finally, because they are our age. They belie the excuse that we must wait to be older to put our civic muscles to good use, and are part of a raucous cadre of folks figuring out how to plant the old seeds of moral economics into the new soil of our generation's culture. So just before I get into introducing them, I'd like to call out a few people, groups in the audience. Is anyone here found out about us from left Twitter? Anyone? Okay, anyone found out about this event from Catholic Twitter? Or weird Twitter? Okay, thank you so much for coming. If anyone come here from Solidarity Hall, the wonderful group on Facebook working to put together a Catholic left and a religious left. Some of you are here today from that. Yes, right there. And anyone who's a gray wolf and member of the Chapel Trap House or the insurgent magazines like Jacobin or Current Affairs. We got Nathan J. Robinson in the house today. Let's hear for Nathan J. Robinson. So there is an insurgence, and we've got two stars of the insurgents here today. Elizabeth is an assistant editor at the Washington Post. Her writing focuses on ethics, politics, and culture from a Catholic social justice perspective. What I love about her work is that you can find her writing some beautiful essay on the Gospel of Luke, and then you can also find her doing a tweet storm on how a recent Pepsi commercial is indicative of the tension between the liberal capitalist idea that we can purchase our way to peace on earth and the disillusionment of being a deracinated market agent. Not the usual Twitter fare. Not the usual Twitter fare. Matt is an incisive poverty analyst and a fellow Twitter legend with his wife, who has written for Jacobin, Demos, The Atlantic, Dissent, and The Washington Post. George Orwell once said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." Matt is very, very good at seeing what is in front of our noses, writing pieces that get to the heart of economic justice questions of our time. I'm just going to give one example, one of the, if you don't know about Matt Bruenig. Matt's latest viral post was in response to those who said, we can't have a universal basic income because people will just get passive money and it'll be divorced from working. He deeply and simply pointed out that 30% of all income produced in the nation is paid out to wealthy people as capital passive income. He asks if passive income is so destructive to our moral character that you would think that centuries of dedicating 1/3 of our national income to it would have burned society to the ground by now. $1 in $10 of income produced in this country is paid out to the richest 1% without having to work for it. If it's so destructive, this is surely a national emergency. Where does the 1% get its meaning with all this free cash flow? So that's a classic Matt Bruenig nugget of clarity, and there's more where that came from. So without further ado, here we're starting off with Elizabeth Bruenig.
Hi, I'm Liz Bruenig, the nicer half of the Bruenigs. If you come from Twitter, you probably already know that. Thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much, Pete, for having us. It's a huge honor. And it was fun riding the train out. We have a 10-month-old daughter. She's with her grandma. It's our first big trip away. So it's a new experience for all of us and a great experience. So thank you so much. I'm very, very happy to be here and very happy that people with your training and your capabilities are having these conversations, interested in these subjects. So thank you very much. A little about me. I'm from Twitter. Before I came from Twitter, I was a freelancer. Before that, I was in a PhD program at Brown. I did the Christian history of private property. Before that, I was a Marshall Scholar at Cambridge, getting my degree in Christian theology. Before that, I was just an undergrad, but at Brandeis. And so I spent a lot of time in Harvard Square. It's a lovely area. Matt and I used to come here a lot when he was in law school at Boston University. And so it's wonderful being back. Lots of memories, especially rainy, freezing Aprils. Great memories. But it's good to be back on the nice brick lanes. So again, thank you for having us. So I wanted to start off in the very distant past. That's sort of where I focus all my time. It seems a bit quixotic, but is a lot of fun, and I think sheds a lot of light on how we got to where we are. So one of the questions before us is, how do we build a moral economy? There are actually two uses of moral economy. You'll hear some people talk about moral entrepreneurs, and that's people who are just sort of like in the commerce of morality, buying and selling how to be a good person. People who do sort of trainings on diversity and sensitivity and things like that, and people who purchase those services. That's the moral economy that I think has already been constructed. So we're not addressing that moral economy. We're talking about trying to construct an economy that responds to its moral obligations. So what I mean by a moral economy is an economy that seems to respond to the moral obligations as we understand them. And that might sound like a contradiction in terms. In the United States, we tend to think of economies as sort of scientific entities with activities that exist apart from the state and apart from society, and according to prerogatives and laws that are sort of like the physical laws of nature, and less like the constructed laws of governments and societies. We can talk about how we, as participants in the economy, can be more morally upright. And this is sort of movements like being a conscientious consumer, being an ethical consumer. But it's much more difficult to articulate how the economy itself can operate according to certain moral standards. There are quite a few reasons we find it challenging to talk about moral economies, but one is that our economy is here. It's humming along for better or worse, and it's a little tough to talk about building things that already exist. The constructed resists construction, as I used to say to my grad students, who would boo me. So in thinking about the moral lives of economies, I find it helpful to look at a period when everything had fallen apart spectacularly, and none of the normal assumptions about how markets or laws or property worked really seem to apply or obtain very much anymore. That's why I like to read St. Augustine. You know who that is? St. Augustine, the give me chastity and continence, but not yet guy, better known for his writing on sex, but wrote tons and tons and tons of words, millions of words actually, and a lot of it was on private property and ownership. A bit more woke than you might expect, given his writing on sex. So Augustine was a Christian bishop who wrote some of the foundational theological work of the Catholic Church in the 4th and 5th centuries in North Africa. He was half black, he was an educated man, and had at one time been a teacher of rhetoric. He was also a Roman citizen tasked with chronicling the fall of the heretofore invincible Roman Empire through Christian eyes. Such a massive upset as the collapse of Rome could have given someone reason to doubt divine providence, but Augustine looked at it a different way. He saw opportunity. And in his greatest work, City of God, he set about illuminating the loving hand of God in even such tumultuous times as his. A little beam of hope for you. But more interesting for our purposes is Augustine's on-the-ground practical writing for a civilization in upheaval. With Roman law and Roman social order less obvious in light of the empire's stumbling than they had been before, Augustine found himself able to work with the raw materials of lawmaking and order creating. He was in the position to explain to Christians what the nature of these things was, and their nature, he found, is moral. In one sermon, Augustine delved into the nature of property ownership and governance. He writes, God has made the rich and poor of one clay. The same earth supports the rich and poor alike. But it's by human right that someone says, this estate is mine, this house is mine, this slave is mine. By human right, therefore, that is the right of the emperor. Why? Because God has distributed to mankind these very human rights through the emperors and kings of this world. What Augustine is saying is, though everything was initially given to people in common, and we were made in common and were together, divisions arose through sin and through time, and the way that order is introduced back into those divisions is through institutions like the state. The state creates institutions like private property ownership. It creates a legal reality of owning materials, and that helps to introduce order into an otherwise chaotic world upset by sin. Augustine supposed the introduction of governance, though ultimately a result of sin, was a gift from God meant to remedy a situation in which people could no longer rightly regulate their own impulses. Good governance had, he thought, a better shot at preventing constant antagonism between neighbors than an ill-fated anarchic utopianism. In Augustine's view, the regulation of private property was just one such function of government. But how were governments supposed to set up the rules of ownership? Augustine was not a radical interventionist in this respect, though he did, in what's often considered one of his less shining moments, induce the government to deprive a heretical sect of Christians he found himself in conflict with of their property. It's really interesting. They write him a letter where they're like, hey, we've worked for this, we built it. And he's like, labor mixing doesn't matter. So you get an early rebuttal of Locke. Before you ever get Locke, you get Augustine saying, I don't care if you worked with it. Not yours. Paraphrasing. By Augustine's lights, there were two worlds of ownership. There was the legally valid and the morally valid. In one intriguing letter, he writes, who is more cruel, the one who steals from or cheats a rich man, or the one who destroys a poor man by usury? What is acquired by this way is certainly ill-gotten gain, and I would wish restitution to be made of it, but it's not possible to use in court. The whole world is the wealth of the faithful man, but the unfaithful one has not a penny. Here he's quoting Proverbs 17:6. Here, we do not prove that those who seem to rejoice in lawfully acquired gains. Here, do we not prove those who seem to rejoice in lawfully acquired gains and do not know how to use them are actually in possession of another man's property? This becomes a long-running theme in Catholic social teachings called the social mortgage of private property. That is, that it's possible for the rich, through over-acquisition of wealth, to be in possession of what is literally the property of the poor. In other words, there is a moral and legal dimension to property ownership itself, and the legal reality can either correspond closely, distantly, or not at all with the moral dimension. Augustine doesn't appear to demand that the two dimensions be in total alignment, but he does point out there's something a little disturbing about instances in which the legal reality of ownership is extremely removed from the moral dimension, as when, for instance, a rich person destroys a poor person through usury. And there's something obviously immoral about that. There's no way for a poor man to seek restitution in a court of law. That, Augustine says, he would change. And we can think of a lot of corresponding realities in our world today. Some of the payday loans, which are very predatory, some of the predatory lending that went on during the crisis that became the 2008 financial crisis, which a lot of those top bankers have never gone to prison, because it's not possible in many cases for people who enter into contracts, even though they're exploitive and abusive, even though there's a massive imbalance between the richness of the person and the poorness of the person involved to make restitution in court. They can't go seek restitution for those wrongs. But Augustine would change that. And that's an obvious opening where we can think about the distance between the moral dimension of property and the legal dimension as they've come to exist, and how we can bring those closer into alignment. Maybe this seems to cast a shadow of theocracy over otherwise secular institutions. Why impress a moral vision upon our property and laws if we're getting along fine without doing that? One answer to that question is we're not getting along fine. Another answer would be our property laws already have a moral vision. And both are true. But I'm going to take on the latter one. Consider what a person has to do to receive welfare benefits if they're poor. In some states, there are efforts accomplished or afoot to test welfare beneficiaries for drug use before remitting them their benefits, as though people who are addicted to drugs have less need of help, not more. Our nation has also dallied with workfare, the enforcement of work in order to receive one's due benefits. These aren't unusual policies either. As recently as the 2016 presidential election, policies proffered by both parties argued for making either students work in return for public payment of tuition or placing work requirements on the use of Medicaid. The arguments are often presented in practical form, but the moral dimension is clear. Work is good, and it's better if a person is responsible and upright than dissolute. And since the remittance of public benefits is one intersection of the government with the individual's private life, it becomes a handy locus for enforcing some form of moral improvement. Of course, when taken in the Augustinian light, we can see the entire institution of property ownership is legally realized, is a function of the state, And we can recognize each instance of ownership as an intersection between a citizen's life and the power of government. Matt will tell you a lot more about that in just a minute. But in that case, we can rightly ask, as Cambridge theologian John Milbank, odd guy, good points, does, why we apply different standards to the poor than the rich. If money given the poor must sometimes require they give something in return, work, then this rule must also apply to the rest of us. For if the poor are us, then we are also the poor, at bottom entirely dependent on the bounty of nature and the gifts of other human beings. It follows then that the wealthier should also receive as reward in terms of salaries, bonuses, and state benefits only what can be justified in terms of their need and their contribution. If workfare involves mutual fairness, then this implies such a principle should be applied all the way up. And that would be both radical and Christian. But we could also just stand to do away with the semi-punitive distributional impulse altogether and just work, like Augustine did, with the raw materials before us. What is property? What is all this stuff for? The crisis of climate change offers another opportunity to really reassess the purpose of the material world. Now that it's compromised, maybe we can develop a clearer vision of what we should have been doing all along. Those shoulda questions are moral questions in disguise. They ask us to evaluate the purpose of things we have, and once we know the purpose, we can begin to think about what we ought to do. When you know what something is for, you have a better sense of how to use it. And this is how you unearth the moral dimension of the economy. So that's how I see step one of putting together a moral economy. I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about how these explorations play out in law in the modern world. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for having us. The last time I was in a law school was 3 years ago at Boston University, where I attended law school. But I was not often in the classroom because I had the kind of, strategy of waiting until the end of the semester and getting an outline and escaping with a gentleman's fee, which is not a bar if you want to go into labor law. They don't actually care about that. A very good way to also keep the temptations down, because no one will hire you. So, not a good idea if you're going to get fired, though, later. Because they still do oddly care about grades at that point. Since we're at a law school, I figured that I would just discuss primarily my favorite Supreme Court case. This is a case that many of you probably read in your constitutional law class, but one that whose radical and I think correct implications you may not have fully internalized. It's a case that if you read the law review literature, which I have in anticipation of this event, almost everyone says is not correctly decided, but it is actually correctly decided, I would maintain. So the case I'm referring to is Shelley versus Kramer, which was decided in 1948. If that name rings a bell, but you can't quite place it, you might remember it as the racially restrictive covenant case. At least that's the tagline most people give it. That's how it's usually taught. I remember it as the case in which the Supreme Court realized for a brief moment in time that there is no such thing as private economic action. So the facts of Shelley are pretty straightforward. June 1934, we have a property owner in Detroit, Michigan. They execute a contract that says their property shall not be used or occupied by any person or persons except those of the Caucasian race. There were some other clauses in the contract stating that that restriction only comes in effect if 80% of the neighbors sign a similar agreement, which they then did. Around 10 years later, the black family bought a plot of land in that neighborhood, and the people who had signed on to the restricted pact were naturally not very happy with that, and they sued in court. And they simply said, force our contract. We have a contract, it's pretty straightforward, get them out. And the trial court did, and the state appeals court did, and I don't know if it went to the state Supreme Court, but on the state level, they were all, yeah, it was a contract, enforce it. The black family then appealed the case to the Supreme Court, arguing that their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection had been violated. Now, on its face, this challenge might seem doomed to fail, and that's how most of the secondary literature says it should have failed. Because as every annoying person on the internet will tell you the Constitution only applies to government. It only applies to state action. It doesn't apply to private individuals or private action. Thus, it would seem that since the contract in question was a private one entered into private individuals, the Constitution does not forbid it. But this is not the conclusion that the court reached. It did not simply rehearse its precedent about the Constitution only binding state actors and then dispose of the case. Instead, it reasoned that although the making of the No Blacks Allowed agreement did not involve any state action, the enforcement of it does involve state action. Because it is the state, through the courts and the police, that is ultimately charged with kicking the black family off the land. And the court makes this point as head-on as you possibly can. So here's some good sort of text from the decision. We have no doubt that there's been state action in this case in the full and complete sense of the phrase. It is clear that but for the active intervention of the state courts, supported by the full panoply of state power, petitioners would have been free to occupy the properties in question without restraint. The difference between judicial enforcement and non-enforcement of the restricted covenants is the difference to petitioners between being denied the rights of property available to other members of the community and being accorded full enjoyment of those rights on an equal footing. Now, to me, the logic of the court is undeniable. Right? Contracts do not enforce themselves. Property laws do not enforce themselves. Nothing about our economy is self-enforcing. Within every transaction, every agreement, every property claim, there is the hand of the state promising to apply or actually apply coercive violence in order to make the economic arrangements work. So, put simply, the Shelley Court realized that the public-private distinction that we hold so dear in constitutional jurisprudence is actually incoherent. There is no such thing as a private sphere of economic action separate from the state's police powers. Now, sadly, this court's take proved too hot to handle, and subsequent courts did not embrace its underlying logic. There are some great cases where unions try to push this theory, and they got denied every time. But, you know, when you're right, even if nobody else agrees with you. So. Now, the Shelley case is iconic in legal realist circles. If you've dipped your toe in that here, the king of legal realism, Robert Hale, actually helped draft briefs for the Shelley case. And Robert Hale is one of my favorite thinkers. He wrote a famous 1923 paper titled "Coercion and Distribution in a Supposedly Non-Coercive State" that I think is critical to framing the discussion of political economy in general. In that paper, Hale painstakingly explains that what we frequently refer to as voluntary economic actions, void of state coercion, are anything but that. For instance, he uses this example. When I go pay $1 for a bag of peanuts, he uses a nickel, but it was in 1923, so. This seems like a voluntary thing, but in fact, the only reason I do so is because the state has threatened to violently attack me if I simply grab the bag of peanuts without paying. So the choice between starvation and payment is a false choice created by the state and its laws. Similarly, in the case of labor, Hale notes, as does Marx before him, though Hale makes no reference to Marx, but I find really strange, that the law of property coerces those without property into obeying employers, also through this debt of starvation. Hale was not a great writer, but I think we do need to power through one of his quotes, so it's good. Some text from the guy himself. So here he says, "Unless the non-owner can produce his own food, the law compels him to starve if he has no wages, and compels him to go without wages unless he obeys the behests of some employer. It is a law that coerces him into wage work under penalty of starvation unless he can produce food." Can he produce food? Here again, there is no law to prevent the production of food in the abstract, but in every settled country there is a law which forbids him to cultivate any particular piece of ground unless he happens to be an owner. This again is the law of property, and again will not likely be lifted unless he already has money. The way of escape from the law-made dilemma of starvation or obedience is closed to him. It may seem that one way of escape has been overlooked, the acquisition of money in other ways than by wage work. Can he not, after all, make money by selling goods? But here again, things cannot be produced in quantities sufficient to keep him alive except with the use of elaborate mechanical equipment, what we would call means of production. To use any such equipment is unlawful except on the owner's terms. Those terms usually imply an abandonment of any claim to the title of the products. In short, if he be not a property owner, the law which forbids him to produce with any of the existing equipment and the law which forbids him to eat any of the existing food will be lifted only in the case he works for an employer. It is the law of property which coerces people into working for factory owners. So, I could go on, but the basic gist is clear, right? As we see in Shelley and Hale and the legal realists, the laissez-faire hegemony that we live in, which kind of sells us this libertarian frame of a private market involving private individuals carrying out voluntary transactions, is not quite right. The economy is, at its core, a bundle of coercive legal institutions that construct things like property law and contract law and securities law and corporations law and bankruptcy law and labor law and all the rest of it. It's this constellation of man-made coercive institutions that collectively determine how production is organized and how wealth and income are distributed in society. So one implication of this is that it is our laws that make people homeless by forbidding the homeless from simply moving into nearby buildings. It's our laws that make people poor by preventing them from helping themselves to the plenty around them. It's our laws, had they been mutually enforced in Shelley, that would have kept a black family from living in the home they had purchased. In this way, our laws are responsible for every economic injustice we see in society. Now, because all economic orders are built upon coercively imposed laws and enforcement institutions, the key question, in my view, for the political economy is how should we undertake this coercion fairly and with respect to the equality of all people? The application of coercion in society to create an economy is not something that we should take lightly. It's a very serious thing to start establishing by coercive rule that people can and cannot use this, can and cannot consume this, and where they can and cannot go. And when embarking on that task, we absolutely must ensure that the coercive rules we pick, whether they're libertarian, social democratic, socialist, welfare liberalism, whatever, that they do not starve people, they do not create humiliating and brutal imbalances in power and wealth, and they do not deny people basic dignity and inclusion in society. Thank you.
I'll start with just some preset questions. So, Matt, would it be fair to summarize what you said, and I'd love you to elaborate on this if I get it wrong, that libertarian economists basically want to say it's all economics and then the state comes in. And you were basically saying it's all politics.
Right.
Yeah.
That's basically right, yeah. There's a funny, one of the articles I read in anticipation of this is Richard Posner. Are you guys familiar? He wrote this paper about Robert Hale in which he's like, like, yeah, it's right, but, like, this just destroys everything. Like, sometimes it's easy just to tear things down and not get an alternative. So he essentially endorses this idea, like, we need to pretend that libertarian frames where we think of a private economy that is sort of over here and the government's over here, and they only meet when the government, occasionally decides to regulate or tax or whatever, that's the only good model for thinking about jurisprudence and stuff. That doesn't just collapse everything that we've built up and that's essentially ends up being his take. Is just like, it's almost like a Straussian, like, let's just pretend, because if we don't pretend, all these distinctions that we've built up aren't real. But of course, I don't think the distinctions are good, so I think it's good to collapse them out a little bit and feel more comfortable with the idea that, yeah, in a given case of, say, employment discrimination, it's the state that ultimately says that, oh, this person can't work here, because it's the state that, if the employer calls them up on the phone and it's like, hey, this guy, he says he's going to work here, and the only reason I didn't hire him is because of his race. This is the state that comes and kicks him off, or the state that comes and kicks the union off, or, right? So the state is actively involved in every piece of the economy. And that, I think, when you can accept that frame and get out of the libertarian frame, which tries to, like, rid the government's hands of it, then you have to take responsibility for what the economy looks like. You can't just be saying like, oh, well, you know, they're homeless and, you know, it is what it is, you know, so sad. It's like, no, they're homeless because of the institutions we've created.
And what's odd about the traditionalist argument, in a way that we would be getting rid of all these institutions that are helpful to us and collapsing everything, is that the institutions, you know, in the way that Matt describes them as we're viewing them now, in sort of the everyday libertarian frame, are not traditional. That's the non-traditional way to do it. It has already collapsed everything. So this would be a restoration of a more traditional way of thinking about society and the government and property.
Yeah, that's true. This is interesting. Like, if you like run the historicals like tape, this laissez-faire thing only comes in the last, you know, couple hundred years. Prior to that, the understanding of the economy as this separate entity of like private action would not be the case. And there, if you read enough libertarians, there are some that recognize this. So like Murray Rothbard wrote that the like laissez-faire liberal revolution in the economy was like the greatest permanent revolution ever, like that overthrew everything that came before it. So it's an interesting situation because we tend to think of it as like, no, that is sort of like our ancient institutions. That's common law. That comes from, you know, the medieval like swamp of law, or whatever. It's like, no, that wasn't the case. Like that actually they had to overturn a lot of medieval understandings to get to where we are now.
And so a question for Liz on that. So if it's all, so a lot of liberal discourse has bought into a lot of the left, at least 70s through the early 2000s, was bought into the it's all economics frame, and all we can do is tinker to help out, pour some sugar on the other side's world. And but if we're going to say that it's all politics, we have to start having a moral language again. And that's a lot of what you speak to. There's not many young millennial left of center people that are talking in this that are kind of moving beyond it's all rights and it's all tinkering after the fact. So what's your history of, you know, speaking in a moral language about this, drawing on, you know, who in our generation is citing Augustine and things like that? So tell us about that path. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I don't expect everybody to get Augustine. It's a long dive. But, you know, who in our generation is talking in moral language about the economy? There's one 75-year-old who's an honorary millennial. That's Bernie Sanders. And I think that what was so attractive, what was so visually attractive about his campaign was that he didn't explicitly say, to the degree that maybe Matt and I do, that it's all politics, but he was willing to say the situation that we have where there are 25% of kids living in poverty, they don't have any road out of it, there's sort of shut down social mobility, and so on and so forth, is just wrong. It's not unfortunate, it's not a sort of like natural evil. In some Catholic world, you think there being natural evils like sicknesses and volcanoes, and say, oh, no, that's the breaks. And all you can do is try to make up for it in certain ways, like you're saying. And I think that's a pretty typical sort of Democratic Party way of thinking about the sort of ravages of inequality and poverty, because the Democratic Party is a liberal party, and they tend to think of the economy, again, as divorced from the state. And there's also been like a neoliberal revolution that came out in the late 70s and 80s. It said, just market solutions, market solutions, market solutions. You can't tinker with the market, you can only try to guide it, basically. So I think once you move past that, you go backwards in time. You get to the way people used to think. And that's weird. That's bizarre. That's strange for a young left person to find themselves in a situation where they're like, the closest people to me are New Deal Democrats. But New Dealers were speaking a moral language because, like Augustine, they were in a time of extraordinary upheaval. Everything had fallen apart. You were dealing with the Great Depression, the World Wars. Liberalism had to answer for itself because what was supposed to be an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, ushered in by the Enlightenment, where you ended the sectarian conflicts that preceded the 17th century, had spectacularly exploded into the most horrific, viscerally terrifying acts of violence the world could remember at the time. You look at how people write about World Wars I and II, the acts of violence they had seen in terms of chemical attacks, trench warfare, were just not part of their cultural memory. It was absolutely horrific to them. And liberalism had to show up and answer for itself. And so the way it did that was oftentimes in expressions of social democracy, was in a renewed expression of morality in economies vis-a-vis states taking some responsibility. And I think that we're potentially in a situation that's a lot like that now. Obviously, we haven't had the experience with war that the New Dealers had, but we've had experience with violence. War is no longer economically desirable, so now we have terrorism, we have guerrilla warfare, and we have just really, really extreme levels of inequality. So I think those destabilizing forces are what are ushering a lot of conversation that resembles that one in a lot of ways.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. There are many more. There's controversy that surrounds this, and I'm going to leave it to people in the audience to bring that up. So, or any other questions they have for Matt. Yep.
This is a question for, I guess, both of you, but mostly for Elizabeth, which is, how do you see the reconciliation of the kind of moral tradition that grows out of the Catholic social justice movement with the very archly secular spirit of socialism on a more historical basis? From where do we get the morals?
Yeah, so I mean, everyone, there's a secular sourcing of morality. There is. And there's also a distinctly Christian sourcing of morality. What I think historians like Sam Moyn, if anyone's read his book on Christian human rights, great guy, he's writing now, he's also a younger guy. What I think historians have been very good at demonstrating is that in many cases, there's been a great synthesis of Christian morality and very distinctly Christian morality, stuff issuing from the Vatican in the wake of the World Wars, and the outgrowth of secular conceptions of rights and duties and obligations that states have to citizens that has been very positive. So, in Rawlsian terms, there's a way to express in public reason what Christian ethics come to in distinctly Christian ways. So I do think a synthesis is possible. And another historical tip in that direction is, even in Europe today, there are lots of Christian social democratic parties that do very well for themselves. And they have been more or less Christian over time, and they argue with members of the left inside their coalitions. But the point is they're able to have a coalition. One thing I'd like to remind people of is you don't argue with people who are nothing like you. They're not proximate enough. You don't talk to each other. You argue with people who are almost like you. So the fact that sort of Christian social democrats and Christian leftists have, in a lot of cases, pretty raucous arguments with the secular left is a pretty good sign of the possibility of coalition, because they're quite near one another, near enough to nitpick. You don't nitpick with people who are very different than you. And so I think it's a good sign. I think history nods in the direction of a secular left Christian coalition. In the United States, the secular left is really more vitalized than the Christian left, because of the way our politics unfolded. So I think that the interesting thing we'll be seeing if there's a possibility of like Christian left resurgence.
Other questions? Let's do your order.
Hey, I'm a Twitter user at shoulderpubes. If I was wearing a tank top, it'd be clear why.
That's my favorite intro.
So I understand sort of the central thesis that the economy is like actively constructed by the state, and sort of the guiding principle that it should be more moral. But the talk is called like building a moral economy, so I was hoping you could give some like concrete steps in moving in that direction.
Well, I mean, in terms of...
I'm not going to tell you about as many tax items.
Well, right, so you have to distinguish between, are we talking about the, like, politics and organizing and stuff, or are we talking about programs? So, I mean, in terms of programmatic stuff, I always just think, let's look at the countries that are doing a good job, that have low poverty, have low inequality, and see what they do. And so that's where naturally start gravitating towards the Nordic model, because they have such low poverty and such low inequality. And, the way that they tend to do that is they talk about three, legs of their system. You have a highly organized labor market that features very compressed wage differentials. So the top incomes are kind of squeezed down and bottom incomes are squeezed up in terms of wage rates. And that helps, create a lot of equality at the market distribution. And then the second thing you have is a very big, expansive universal welfare state where they tax as much as 50% of GDP in a given year and pay out, free or heavily subsidized childcare, free health care, a check for every family with children, disability, pensions, old age pensions, free elder care, disabled care, like taking care of all those risks that are associated with living in an economy where income mostly comes from the market, and you find ways to get money to people who can't get money from the market. Kids don't work, disabled people don't work, college students are not working, that sort of thing. So you kind of bring you dedicate a big chunk of the national income to making sure those people get paid out. And then the third is full employment. So try to get as many people into the workforce as possible. In the U.S., we struggle a lot with female labor force participation, which is a function of low child care benefits and paid leave and that sort of thing, which tends to push a lot of women to drop out of the labor force because caring for a child is so expensive if you don't have benefits and that sort of thing. So that's an easy way to move that third leg here. So that tends to be what I write about because it already exists as kind of a proven thing.
Other questions? Okay, let's go right there.
This is for either or both of you. How would you respond to those who might agree with the slogan, "It's all politics," but sort of conclude from that making a moral argument doesn't matter. What matters is engaging in politics. For example, maybe with respect to the New Deal example that was discussed, they might say, it's not the moral sensibility of liberals which changed. It was militant labor activism that forced the hand of liberals.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that goes to the second sense of how do you build it, which is just the politics of organizing, that sort of thing. And historically, both in the U.S. and other countries, the big pushes to make a more equal economy out of the old sort of laissez-faire economy came from organized labor for the most part. They built out big parties and also a lot of strength in the workforce, ability to shut down production and that sort of thing. So that was why I went into labor laws under that hope of, okay, well, this seems to be the way you do it. But there might be other models as well. Maybe you can build other organizations, dues-paying organizations that aren't necessarily connected to labor. But I do agree that mass organization and mass mobilization is the only way to really get most of this stuff done. But I'm not necessarily clear how to do
I would say
that.
in the United States, it's important to mount a moral case for even labor organizing because there are people who have succeeded in making that type of organization appear immoral. There have been major campaigns to make labor organizing look greedy, lazy, to make it look like people who are, that don't care about their families. There have been extraordinary campaigns to make organizers look like sort of mafia figures or pseudo-criminal. And so I think when you're dealing with people in the United States on the ground right now who have that history in their minds, it's very important to make to them the moral case. You're not doing anything wrong, you're doing everything right. You have rights, you have dignity as a person, as a worker. There should be dignity in your work. There should be wages accorded to you that you can support yourself and your family. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's what the Catholic worker movement was all about as well. So the fact that we've needed those kinds of moral movements in the past to activate even mass labor organizing makes me think that we probably will again, just because of the money and the power behind the other side. But certainly I think that it's not all it's needed. And maybe not everyone who's willing to engage in poverty, to engage in politics will need that kind of encouragement, but some people will.
For those that don't know, could you unpack what was the Catholic work movement?
It's Catholic work movement. You know Dorothy Day? Yeah, so lots of really exciting people in the Catholic worker movement. But it began as a movement to organize Catholic workers and to take Catholic social justice concepts, Catholic teaching on the economy and on property and on work, and to try to organize Catholics to advocate for and demand those kinds of rights in the workplace. So there's a great paper associated with it called The Catholic Worker, and a lot of times when you meet very dear and very wonderful older Catholics today who are sort of on the left labor side, they will come out of that tradition. And while it was flourishing, it was pretty impressive.
Other questions? We'll do back there.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm a graduate student here in sociology. I also write for Current Affairs, so please don't run away. I have some free magazines if you So my question is, to kind of build on that, what's your guys' sense? So it seems to me that there's some on the left who thinks we should maybe completely give up on the Democratic Party, maybe liquidate them, something along those lines, or on the right, or maybe some version of cooperation, cajoling them, finding some coalition or whatever. I guess my sense, or I'd like to hear from you, what's your sense on how liberals are processing things these days? What's the healthy relationship the left can have with liberals at this time? Maybe a bit of a sore subject, but
I don't know. I mean, I have it's hard to figure out where the weight of liberal opinion is, because I don't think liberals in the media are good representatives of liberals more broadly. So one good example of this is if you look at a lot of pundits who are either on TV or writing, who were more to the center of the Democratic Party, they're still very angry at Bernie Sanders and they don't like him and they tweet a lot of negative things about him. But then when you go and look at favorability polling and they ask people who voted for Clinton, do you have a favorable opinion of Bernie Sanders? It's like 87% have either a strongly or somewhat favorable opinion of Bernie Sanders. And so it's like, I don't know, there's such a big disconnect between the liberal leadership and actual, liberals on the ground that are, that it's hard to know, I guess, where they stand. But if you're only talking about elite politics, I don't think that liberal establishment types, if you will, are happy with the leftist insurgents and Bernie and on Pete Ellison and all that. And so my sense has been that you still have to fight them and try to beat them at local levels and obscure state precinct races and that sort of thing. If your goal is to change the Democratic Party, it's got to be hostile at this point because they're not willing to accommodate or, share power or whatever. As to whether it's even worth trying, that's a more difficult question. We've always had two parties in this country. I think that's the strongest argument that, given the way the voting works, you're always going to have two parties. So, maybe you just do have to try to get one of them on your side to have any effect.
Questions? Right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking a lot about the political atmosphere and at the national level, and I'm just wondering if you think that there's capacity, from a political standpoint, it's much easier to create actionable change at the local level or even at the state level. But do you think that it has to come from a certain extent top down? And I raised my hand when we were talking about sort of labor and the vilifying labor and whatnot in that. We've seen actions in the past where organization in one state just sends a firm to another state in the capacity for corporations to do that. So do you think that there's a possibility for strong actionable change at state and local levels, or do we need to really get that overall top-down party buy-in to make it happen?
So I think you can win stuff on the state level. It just looks very different, right? So states and localities are going to have a much harder time building out a big welfare state because for various reasons, people can leave the state, people might be attracted into the state, so you have like adverse selection problems on both sides. Both the payers, the rich might leave, or businesses might leave, and the recipients, you might attract people into the state. So the great thing about using it nationally is you have a full country. You don't have to worry about people really, people don't usually immigrate out of the U.S., entirely because of, they don't like taxes or whatever. That's just a huge move. But moving, across the line from New York to New Jersey or something is pretty easy. So that's the problem the state has, is it's much more, affected by those competitive dynamics. But there are things you can do on the local level, make services better, that sort of thing. But it's just a different, I would just say it's you just have to have a totally different world, a totally different vision of what, local socialism looks like, if you will, and state socialism and national socialism.
Well, local socialism can custom people to a certain style of program or a certain level of benefits that as they grow, especially if they're raised with those programs from childhood, as they grow into sort of political actors, they think, no, this is completely ordinary, it's not a big ask, it's how things ought to be. And as they become active on the national level of politics, you can see a change of party composition just by bringing in lots of people who have grown up with programs like that. So you can see a different Democratic Party in a sort of peaceable way, just through overturning, if you were able to make a lot of changes on the local level.
Final question from the crowd right there.
Hi, I want to go back to your comments about the secular and Christian left. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the way you think that these two groups can be persuasive to each other. To what extent it is more helpful to secularize that conversation or to make the religious and secular differences explicit but productive?
Yeah, I tend to lean towards explicit but productive. And the reason that I like to do that is because I never want anyone to think I'm hiding them all. Conversations go really bad when you're sort of a religious person, you don't give any indication that you're religious, you speak in a totally secular kind of Rawlsian language, and then someone Googles you and it's like, what? The long tentacles of the papal octopus. Yes, I wasn't trying to hide it, so I always come to conversations and say, like, no, I'm not trying to, overtly theocratize anyone. Christians in this country and other religious groups in this country, they're just groups, right? And so it's best, I think, to be honest about our differences, say, I know you don't agree with me on X or Y, I'm not trying to make you. When I go into a conversation where we're organizing for a policy, like a child allowance or something, it'll often come up that, my views on whatever other issue are in line with Catholics. I understand. I'm not asking you to support this thing. I'm not asking you to endorse me as a person. I'm asking, can we work together on this program? And I think that those are very productive conversations. People like it when you treat them with dignity, and they like it when you respect their intelligence. You say, look, I know we have differences. You understand that. I know you understand that. I'm being totally transparent. This is about a program or policy or even a vision of the economy. And I think we can work together on it. I think that's pretty persuasive on both sides.
As a final question, we like always ending these talks since our theme is our school's mission statement of educating leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. What message do you have to young people, and especially young lawyers, about what they can do to help build a moral economy? And fellow young people, actually.
Yeah. Well, I had an easier go of it because I had a public interest scholarship at BU, so I didn't have to deal with the debt stuff. But some fields are good, and you go into those fields, I guess. I mean, I think on an individual level, it's very hard, right? So, I worked at the NLRB for a couple of years, and I got to do a lot of good stuff. But also, if they didn't hire me, they would have hired someone else, and they probably also would have done a good job. So, it's something I tend to focus more on politics and structures than thinking like an individual can go out in their vocation and do unique good that no one else would otherwise do. But there's some value in liking your work and feeling like you're doing good work. So if you can, try to get into fields where you're using your talents to advance the interests of justice, whether it's workers or immigrants or the environment or whatever you're interested in.
Yeah, give with your time. That's all you can do. Everybody's compromised. A lot of people who have lots of debt are going to have to take jobs in fields or industries they don't agree with, or that they're worried about morally. Understand that. That's almost everybody. Don't let that make you feel like there's nothing you can do, or that there's a hypocritical element to you still trying to change in the other direction. There's not. Any small amount that you can contribute of your time, your expertise, your training, your talents is more than would have been contributed otherwise. If you go into an industry worried about it seems compromised to you morally, the fact that you're in it with your moral conscience, evaluating it in that way is still a good thing. So that would be my recommendation. Don't let them grind you down.
What a great way to end it.